Good afternoon. So this is Malachi Cohen, and I'm professor of history and Jewish studies and former director of the Center for European Studies. So I'm an old timer at this lovely gathering of Wednesday at the center. And I'm really sorry not to be with you in person today, as I've fallen ill. All the more so because I wanted to introduce in person our distinguished guest, my old friend, Professor Geoffrey Harpham. So Professor Harpham is a distinguished literary scholar with an amazing theoretical range and interdisciplinary interests. He has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Brandeis, Tulane, and Duke, but many of you may be familiar with him from his illustrious tenure as director of the National Humanities Center between 2003 and 2015. He greatly expanded the national profile of the center and its engagement with the public, contributing greatly to the vitality of the humanities. In recent years, he has turned to broad reflection on the role of the humanities in our national life and culture, and to consideration of the concepts that have become central to our public life. Race is such a concept, and he will share with you today its history and ramification for our public life. Please join me in welcoming Professor Geoffrey Harpham.
Give us just a second while we switch back over to the presentation.
Well, thank you, Malachi, and get well soon. And thanks, Aaron and the Center for hosting me. I'd like to talk to you today about some recent work that I've done on the concept of race. And by the concept of race, I mean the theory of race, not racial relations or racial history, not groups of people, but the theory of race as it was developed in the course of the 18th and 19th century. This approach occurred to me several years ago when, after having written about figures like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois and images of race and nation in popular entertainment, I realized that I had no idea what a race was. I didn't know how anybody had an idea what a race was. I didn't know how it had ever emerged as a topic. I knew that at one time it was not a word, or not a concept, and then it was. And I didn't know the process. I didn't know the history or anything. This seemed to me like a very lamentable gap in my understanding. And so I thought, as a personal project, I would try to gather together the writings that constituted the subject of race as an object of knowledge, an object of scientific knowledge, put them together into one place, maybe write little headnotes, and that would be a tidy little book. This is one of those ideas that seems like a good idea at the time because it seems so doable. But that was several years ago, and the years have not been easy since then. I started out with after a great deal of reading, with about 130 candidates for texts that established the concept of race. I reduced that to about 60. I isolated the passages. I wrote headnotes that could get up to 2,000 or 3,000 words. And the result is, let's see, this website that went online in May of last year. I tried to publish it as a book, but I was having a hard time finding a publisher for what would have been an 800-page book. It's 230,000 words long. And when I was just about to give up and think that I had maybe a personal archive, but not something I could share with the world, I got a call from Henry Louis Gates, whom I've known for many years, and he asked if I would consent to have the thing digitized so he could attach it to a website that he had made. And I sure would, because it cost $50,000 that I was unwilling to pay for myself. And the result was this beautiful and completely functional website. I can attest to its functionality because I've been using it for the last couple of years. Theories of Race, annotated anthology of essays on race. And over here is the meat of the matter. You have an introduction. You have 48 entries with 60 texts, including some well-known figures. David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Jefferson, Frederick Douglass, and so on and so forth. And it has everything that they wrote that contributed to an ongoing collective project of forming a theory of race, something that did not exist. And in fact, it never actually came into fully coalesced form. Now, if before I began this, I was asked what a race was, I'm pretty sure that I would have said that race was a social construction with no basis in biology. I think I would also have said that if there was a science of race, or insofar as there was a science of race, this project was developed by pseudoscientists who were simply being witting or unwitting tools of projects of domination or exploitation or empire or even enslavement. I think I would have agreed with the title of one of the books on race, actually a book I admire a lot, called Race is a Four-Letter Word. But when I studied the matter more deeply, I saw that not only was that true in some ways, but there were also other stories and other trajectories that were far more interesting than simply the morally corrupt and intellectually problematic pursuit of a phantom object. I don't think I've ever been as impressed by the difference between a history of something and the actual stuff that history is a history of than I have been than when I was reading about the subject of race. I found, for one thing, that race has not always been the same subject it is now. It hasn't always been the same word that it is now. Now, when you say race, you realize that the word itself is all tangled up in history, ethics, politics, economics, morality. It's a complicated word. But in the 18th century, it was a simple word. For a couple of centuries, the word had floated around with a very undetermined meaning. It could be applied to horses, a race of horses, or professions, the race of carpenters, royal families, royal, lineage in general, but it had a very unclear meaning. But in the second half of the 18th century, the concept tightened up to become a descriptor of large groups of people, geographically defined, but also defined by their appearance and by their ways of life. The critical event I came to realize was a new way of thinking about human beings, not in the biblical sense of being created directly by God and given dominion over nature, but rather as part of the natural system, a post-theological, if you will, understanding of human beings as part of the natural system. And the system was something some people were beginning to realize that was not immediately obvious, but if we studied it and thought real hard, we could try to understand it. And if we understood the system of nature, we'd understand the secret organizational rationale for everything, animals, vegetables, and minerals. And actually, if we believed in God, as the vast majority of people did in Europe at that time, we would get some insight into the intentions of the Creator as he was creating everything. Linnaeus, the author of A General System of Nature, he wrote in Latin, this is the English translation of the 10th edition, 1758, undertook to categorize about 10,000 entities, animals, vegetables, and minerals, in terms of their, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you? Yes, you can. Classes, orders, genera, species, and varieties. In other words, he had increasing orders of generality. Varieties was the most specific, and classes was the least specific and the vastest. And you can see how this works out when he talks about, when he talks about mammals. This is the page where he deals with mammals. It's the class of mammals defined by lactiferous teats, he said. The order is primates, and the species is Homo sapiens. We are a species of animal that is endowed with the faculty of reason and the capacity for knowledge. It's a sloppy, provisional, and kind of fanciful system. As you see, it starts out with wild men, and it ends up at the bottom, on the lower left there, with monsters. But in the middle there are four groups that a subsequent era would call races. You have Americans, Europeans, Asiatics, and Africans. And he defines them in very traditional ways by their appearance and their temperaments. So that Americans, by Americans, he means American Indians. They're copper-colored, choleric, erect, and if you look at the last sentence there, they are regulated by customs. The next is Europeans. They're fair, sanguine, and brawny, and they are governed by laws. Asiatics, they have black hair, dark eyes, and they are governed by opinions. And then Africans at the end, they're black, phlegmatic, and relaxed, and they are governed by caprice. And this was his way of dividing the world into what would be called races. Now, the interesting thing was that he didn't use the word race because it wasn't available to him in the mid-18th century in the sense that it has become available as a category of human beings. So he used classes, genera, species, and varieties. And the question became, if Linnaeus had had access to the concept of race, where would he have put it? It's not a class, it's not an order or genera. The consensus was that it would oscillate or hover somewhat indecisively between species and varieties. It's something like that. And this is so tantalizing because race is neither definitively species nor varieties, so it could be either one. And really, unwittingly, by creating this pocket of uncertainty about where a race would fit, Linnaeus established the terms of the entire moral and political and historical debate that would follow the next century and a half after him. It's all contained in that uncertainty about whether a race is more like a variety or whether it's more like a species. It's something that he could not possibly have anticipated and certainly wouldn't have sympathized with, but there it is. This is the most compelling system of nature that was on offer at the time. It created an opening for race, but that opening had not been decisively filled. Now, I think that if you were an ambitious intellectual in the 18th century and you heard people beginning to use the word, always hesitantly, always uncertainly, you might have been very intrigued by it because it seems to be a category of nature that is imperfectly understood. And how tantalizing is that? If you knew what race was, I think you would know a lot, and not just about the system of nature. You'd know the organizational plan that governed the universe. You might have some insight into the intentions of God. You could talk about whether human rights belonged equally to all human beings, or whether perhaps some categories deserved more or different human rights than other categories. You could talk about the differences among races as natural distinctions. You could think about what the consequences of that would be if you had natural distinctions among people. You could talk about the human condition in a new way. And in short, the concept of race seemed to be the gateway to a fabulous new frontier of knowledge about the human condition. I think if you were an ambitious intellectual, with a good deal of knowledge of the world, you would at least be interested to prosecute this project and see where it would lead. The first example I'm going to show you, and they come from not from histories of the subject, but from my immersion in the primary texts of the subject, is this man, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. He's the founder of the scientific concept of race. That is, race was floating along, but it was not yet a scientific concept. But Blumenbach, name is not widely known now, but at that time he was the greatest naturalist in Europe, and there was no question about that. He was also one of the most admired and esteemed men in Europe. He was a gentle, benign, pacific soul. He lived a quiet life in a small university town in Göttingen. I visited it last May and spoke with the director of the Blumenbach Institute, who was also a gentle man living a quiet life in a small university town in Germany. And one of his subjects was what he called the natural variety of mankind, which he discussed as part of the natural system. He deeply believed that humanity was a single entity. He refused to rank any kinds of beings so that it was going from high to low. He refused to draw any absolute distinctions. He said that whatever differences there were among groups of people were entirely the consequence of climate, diet, long isolation, ways of life, and things like that, but that there was no natural distinction, certainly not a gradient or a hierarchy among the groups, the human groups. He went out of his way to meet Africans who we could sometimes see in the market. He kept a large library of international books, including many books by African authors. And he resisted the term race. He wrote in Latin, so he didn't have to encounter it. But even when he was writing in German, he didn't like the term race because it suggested a natural division between people, and he thought that was a dangerous concept. He was decisively on the varieties side of the question. In other words, for him, race, if races there were more like varieties than species. But he wanted to try to create an organizational scheme of nature, and he had to acknowledge obvious differences between species and varieties. And these differences, he thought, were not to be found in skin any traveler, if you went around the world, you just see gradations. You know, you'd see clines or small differences, but you didn't see, you know, blocks of people. So skin he threw out as a marker of any kind of group identity. Hair the same way. What he came up with as a way of kind of aid to the memory to think about the broad categories of people was skulls. This is one of the most consequential little illustrations in the history of race, which is to say in the history of a lot of other things too. This is an illustration in his book on the natural varieties of mankind. The one on the left is the Ethiopian. The one on the right is called a reindeer tungus. It's an Asiatic. Then the one in the middle is a Georgian female. One of his correspondents, he had a wide scientific correspondence. One of his correspondents had sent him a single skull from Georgia. And excuse me, because Georgia is in the region of the Caucasus Mountains, where Noah's Ark was said to be beached, Blumenbach decided that the Georgian was the primeval race. I'll read the passage a little later. These are the autochthones of humanity. In other words, these are people who like sprang from the earth, the immediate descendants of Noah's son. Would that be Shem, I think. These are the Georgians. They had deviated the least from their origin. And because this single skull resembled some of the German skulls in his possession, he decided that Europeans should be considered Caucasians. That's it. That's on the basis of a single skull and a story about Noah's Ark, that people who look like me are called Caucasians. There is no other basis. See if I can get the passage where he.
There is somebody admitting them, thank you, on the back end. Yes.
I've taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus, both because its neighborhood and especially its southern slope produces the most beautiful race of men. Elsewhere, he says, according to our ideas of beauty. And because all physiological reasons converge to this, that in that region, if anywhere, it seems we ought with the greatest probability to place the autochthones of humanity, the most primeval, you know, the first race of humanity. For in the first place, that stock displays, as we have seen, the most beautiful form of the skull, from which, as a mean and primeval type, the others diverge. And also, he said, because it's easier for white skin to turn dark than it is for dark skin to turn white. So the first skin must, he said, have been light. Now, this interest in skulls as the basis for some kind of classification of human being dominated the rest of the century. You know, we think of race as a matter of skin. In the 19th century, when the concept or the theory of race was being developed, it was not skin at all. It was skulls. And it was taken up in the United States by a man named Samuel George Morton, who published a book in 1839 called Crania Americana, or American Crania, American Skulls. And he presented a couple of hundred skulls from North and South American Indians. And instead of simply judging them to be more beautiful or less beautiful, he devised ways of measuring the angles in the skull. This is the facial goniometer, a device that he invented in order to measure certain angles. And it's an incredibly, I won't tax you with the description, just pass your eyes over. This is the first of many pages of kind of techne, where he describes how you would measure 16 angles with the facial goniometer and what you would get when you did that. This is page 252. Look what the results are. This is Science in 1839. These are the results of his work. Page after page after page of measurements. And then here, look at this little thing. Note on the internal capacity of the cranium and the different races of man. I have a better image of it in my anthology that enables you to read it more clearly. As the races of man, Caucasian, Mongolian, Malay, American, and Ethiopian. The number of skulls is on the left, the mean internal capacity, the largest and the smallest. The crucial number is the mean internal capacity, because he was not only measuring angles and relationships and proportions, he was tipping the skulls over, stopping up the ear and eye holes, and filling them with seed. And then he would pour the seed into a cylinder to see how many seeds each skull contained. The mean internal capacity showed the volume of the skull. And it's clear here that Caucasians have the greatest volume and Ethiopians have the least volume. Now, he didn't need to draw the obvious, what was to others obvious conclusion. He didn't draw it, that Caucasians are the smartest people and that Ethiopians are the most limited. He didn't need to, because others drew it for him. I think this is the single most consequential footnote in the history of footnotes. And it's completely extraneous. He doesn't even talk about it, but there it is. And people, when they read this, fixed on this. Now, one who did draw the obvious conclusion that Caucasians were the smartest people and Ethiopians were the least smart was Josiah Nott of Mobile, Alabama. This gentleman, he was a very distinguished physician, and I mean that without irony. He discovered the cause of yellow fever infections. He saved tens of thousands of lives in the South. And he was respected as a physician, as a scientist in the North and the South. He lived in Mobile, Alabama. He was a slave owner. He lived in the slave culture. And he was particularly interested in Morton. He thought Morton was doing exciting work. And he was also interested in studies of hybridity. Why hybrid? Why is he interested in studies of hybridity? Because he's trying to define race as species, where Blumenbach was on the variety side of things. Nott was decisively on the side of things that saw race as a species. And, excuse me, he wants to prove this by way of the mortality statistics of mulattoes. He thought that mulattoes were hybrids like mules, and that they were not a natural species to themselves. They could be produced, but they could not themselves reproduce. And in order to make this case, he came up, I've got a more readable text than the facsimile text that I actually used. He cited a very sensible article published in the spring of 1843 in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal that proves, first, that the longevity of Africans is greater than that of the inhabitants of any other part of the globe. Second, the second and third are the meat of the matter, that mulattoes, those born of parents, one being African and the other white, are the shortest lived of any class of the human race. And third, that mulattoes are not more liable to die under the age of 25. They can make it to 25, that's okay. But that from 25 to 40, they die more in greater numbers. And by the time you get from 55 to 70, they die at the rate of 100 to 1, either pure whites or pure blacks. And this proved for Nott that whites and blacks were different species because their offspring had diminished vitality and diminished fertility. The Linnaean conclusion was that there is a genus, man, comprising two or more species. Physical causes cannot change a white man into a black man. And this argument that mankind was divided into two species opened the door to saying we cannot treat these species as if they were equal, because they are not equal. And that the relationship of slavery that we have developed in the South is an inevitable relationship given the excellence of the Caucasians and the limited aptitudes and abilities of the Ethiopians. And therefore, it's integral to the economy of the South and must be permitted to continue. And if the Union disagreed, the South had to secede. That's the argument. He didn't make it all in one place, but he made it in several places. And he was well known to be associated with. Now, you can see that this scientific argument about hybridity in skulls is directly tied to a political argument. So if you're looking for a villain in the story of racial theorizing, you might suspect that Nott would be the prime candidate for that. And also, if you're looking for a pseudoscientist in the history of racial theorizing, Nott is also a prime candidate for that. But what really fascinated me is that Nott was never considered a pseudoscientist, even when the Civil War ended and the South collapsed. And you might think that the entire argument is in ruins. Nott was not vilified. He moved to New York. He became president of the New York Obstetrical Society. He was revered. The rest of his life was one long applause. And he was not only revered in the United States as a distinguished scientist, but he was revered in Europe by the leading scientist in Europe at the time. His chief advocate in Europe is one of the great figures in French science. He's so distinguished that his name is one of the 72 names that's inscribed on the Eiffel Tower as representing the brilliance of the French nation. And Broca was tremendously impressed by Morton's measurement of skulls. He was tremendously impressed by Knott's work on hybridity. And he thought that he, the great scientist who had penetrated the secrets of the brain, could do even better. And so he devoted a good part of his career to developing instruments for more sophisticated measurements. This is one. This is another that I find particularly spooky. And he thought that if he developed enough measurements, and he invented 30 such devices for even more angles and proportions and everything, and he got enough information from enough skulls, eventually he would have a scientific basis for deciding what the fundamental categories of humanity were. These were the actual groups. And he pursued this project until he died in 1880. He founded the Paris Anthropological Society on that basis as an institute that would organize all the information coming in. Everybody who measured a skull would send it to Paris, send the numbers to Paris. So you had physicians all over the world as part of their routine medical examinations, measuring your skull, and then you'd send the results to Paris where it would all be processed and what would one day be a complete explanation of the human condition with all its variations. But when he died, the air went out of the balloon because you had these volumes of information coming in, and the smart people realized that it wasn't adding up to anything. Things were not becoming clearer and clearer. They were becoming more and more muddled all the time. 10 million skulls had been measured by the end of the century. And the leading scientists on the continent did not see their time well spent processing the information from 10 million skulls. And so they came to the conclusion, each in his own way, that something that had been suspected from the very beginning, which is that race did not exist as an object of scientific knowledge, was actually true. And each in his own way published this conclusion. They saw that not only had no number of races ever been established, the guesses were from 1, the human race, to 63, but that nobody knew what or where a race was. It didn't seem to be in the skin. It didn't seem to be in the hair. It didn't seem to be in the skeletal structure. It didn't seem to be in the volume or the shape of the cranium. It didn't seem to be in the soul. How could you study that anyway? Semen was also proposed as a possible object of study, but that didn't work out well. And so what they saw was that race, which was a compelling reality to the eye, was not a legitimate object of science. When you read the end of science, let's see if I can get this here. The end of the century, like from 44 to 48, each one of these people is calling for an end to the science of race. You realize that these men, who were the most distinguished scientists in Europe at the time, all realized that the inquiry into race had not only not solved the problem of race, but it had created a kind of crisis in science itself. Because not only was it not illuminating reality, but it was producing volumes of information about a non-existent object. And so they saw that if they continued to study race in this concentrated, dedicated way, they would bring into question not only the scientific integrity of their work, but also its moral credibility. And this was quite surprising to me. As I said, I began by thinking that racial science was racist in its motivation. But when I looked at the whole trajectory, what I saw was that scientists and thinkers developed the concept, often for good reasons, in pursuit of legitimate questions. They found themselves all tangled up in political and historical projects, of which many of them, the clear majority, disapproved and found revolting. And when they decided that there was nothing there for a scientist to study, virtually all the leading and most respected scientists abandoned it. So I think this fact needs to be stressed. if we owe to science the invention of race, we also owe to science the discovery that race is an invention, or rather that there's nothing in the physical constitution of the human animal that corresponds to the concept of race. It's only because science went through this century-long entanglement with the concept that we are able, I think, to think of race as an unreal reality, an artifact, an invention, part of the sometimes called the built information environment. And this abandonment by science was, I think, all the more impressive because it ran directly against the political currents at the time. At the end of the 19th century, European empires were at full strength. And in the United States, 36 states were passing one after the other Jim Crow laws. So it's not as if science was doing the bidding of power. Science was getting off the boat. And so that power could continue on its way, but it did so without the support of science. By that time, however, the term had been implanted in the popular mind, and the inquiry into race was pursued by second and third-rate scientists, truly pseudoscientists, and by a bunch of ideologues, including reactionaries and fascists in this country and in Europe as well. But, this is the last thing I will say, not only did second and third-rate scientists and reactionaries want to continue the idea of race, there was another group that wanted to, led by this man, W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1897, he was a young man, younger than he is here, and he wrote an essay called The Conservation of Races, in which he said that science might be abandoning this concept, but we, Black people, cannot afford to let it go because it is an invaluable source of strength and solidarity for us. He says the English, they've delivered a constitutional government, and the Germans have given us philosophy and science. Black people have not yet formulated their full message to the world. Until such time as they do, he said, we need to preserve this concept of race. I think Du Bois has been proven right in many ways. Many people, not only Black people, cherish their racial identities. It is a principle of solidarity and affiliation. But I think it's also true that the idea of natural boundaries between groups of people is bleak and mysterious in other ways. And the question is whether the positive aspects of race could be preserved without the negative or destructive aspects. If not, then we have a decision to make. I note that a number of people have recently been suggesting that we can do without the concept of race. After my immersion in this history, this very jagged and eruptive history of the concept, I can well imagine a world in which the concept had never been invented, never been emerged or formulated in the same way as it had been. I can also imagine a world in which, with mixed race people increasing every day, the concept just disappears. I could name a half a dozen people right now who have actually been suggesting in print that the concept should disappear. I can't decide this question at all. That's, of course, a question for the larger culture to answer, and probably not answer it at an individual level, but answer at a collective level. But that's where I've been led to. Thanks for listening.
So I'm going to start with a few questions we have online. The first one, can you name, what was the name of the naturalist that you mentioned at the beginning? Can you repeat that name?
Oh, Linnaeus.
Linnaeus, thank you.
It's easy to answer.
Yeah.
Ask me a tough one.
Easier one.
Yeah.
So the next one I have online is that somebody said they might have missed this, but based upon your research, when did the concept or social construct of race actually begin?
It didn't begin. It's like the Mississippi River. There's no spot where it begins. What you have is a bunch of things that are not Mississippi River, and then at some point it's Mississippi River. But Blumenbach, I would say, is the founder of the scientific concept of race. And by that I mean race not simply used as a word, but explored as a problem. In England, that would be James Cowles Pritchard, a truly fascinating figure, but the first scientist to take race as a problem. And again, he used the word only with great reluctance, but still, I think that's Blumenbach. So that would be at the end of the 18th century. 1795 is the second or the third edition of his most famous work. And if you had to ask me, when did the Mississippi River become the Mississippi River, I would point to On the Natural Variety of Mankind, 1795, third edition. That's a more precise answer, I think, than they were looking for.
Ask another couple questions online. If you have any in the room, just let me know. So this was not aware of the 7-year rule by the early 18th century by which the life expectancy of slaves for purposes of reclaiming their costs on the transatlantic slave market had to be recovered within 7 years. His concept of mulatto fits in with this rule, suitably reconfigured by the forced insemination of African slaves by their white owners in Virginia and elsewhere in the antebellum South.
Could you isolate the question in there?
Was not aware of the 7-year rule that was established in the early 18th century.
If he was, he didn't write about it, but not imagined himself to be, and was really a public figure with other responsibilities than just his medical practice. And he wrote, I think, one of the most disarming articles I've read in this entire history. It was an article in which he was advising insurance companies because it was apparent to him as an advisor to insurance companies that a lot of companies and the investors in those companies were losing money because slaves died early. And so he wrote an essay on the value of a colored life and how the value of a Black person should be calculated. So he thought about that issue a lot.
I'm going to go to the room for those that are joining us online.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. So I do molecular genetics, and I have data from participants, and race, as I do my literature review, race is used as a variable. We include it in the model. Although, so what do you think about that? If race does not have a biological basis, why is it still so relevant in the studies that we do today as one of the variables in our models?
I think you're a better person to answer that question than I am.
No, we have a lot of debates on this, and we do not have an answer yet. And if we do not include it, the reviewers come back and ask us, why haven't you included race? So,
well, let me ask you this: what information do you get out of race? I mean, given that most of us here are mixed race, and given that I'm not even sure what race is, it depends on where you are in time. Like in the year 8000 BC, were there races in the same way that there are now? I'm not clear. In the year 100,000 BC, I'm quite certain that there weren't. So I don't really know what a race is, and I don't know what scientific value the concept would have, except as a way of indicating perhaps, I don't know, something about geography or family or diet or something like that that might affect genes, but the concept does not have scientific validity according to what I understand. It's one of the things that might be passed on in the congenial environment. All the markers of race might be passed on given the right environment, but they also might not be. And so, I don't know, what information do you get out of race as a scientist? Or is it just a matter of sensitivity that you're addressing?
it's just that we include it and we explore it without even thinking about it. We all include it when we give out questionnaires during the study design or during the study, race is always collected as a variable. And once you have that data, we at least analyze it and talk about it. Things get carried on by inertia.
Blumenbach had 5 races. Very few people today believe in 5 races, but it's preserved in the U.S. Census. It has a kind of ghostly afterlife in the U.S. Census. Maybe not among scientists, but things get carried on almost unwillingly.
Well, just responding to that, Rachel, like I'm thinking about your work and I know that it relates to pollution exposure. And so wouldn't race be in the model as also part of understanding racism? Like it's not about the molecular component of it, but it's about the ways that racism influences exposure to pollution and things like that. So it's
socioeconomic.
right. But it's interesting that race and socioeconomic data might prove different exposures to pollution because racism is a thing that affects where you live, as is socioeconomics. Like they're not always matched, you know? A white person and a black person who both make the same amount of money but still not necessarily experience the same exposures. Right, right. Well, yeah, I think it would then reflect information about back in society, not that shows up in your genetics model. Yeah.
So as I get to the other part of the room, I'm gonna ask a quick one. Somebody asked where the 10 million skulls that were measured came from.
It came from all over the world. A lot of the work was done in Europe, where every physician was aware of this project. But they came from all over the world because any physician who was doing a medical exam that included a cranial assessment might well send his results into the Paris Anthropological Society. It's interesting, Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, Marlowe is sent to Africa. And before he's sent to Africa, he's given a medical exam in Brussels. And the doctor measures his skull. And he says he's hoping to contribute to knowledge one day. And Marlowe was very disconcerted to have this machine, this device placed on his skull. But it shows how widespread it was.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the great presentation I learned about. I have two questions. So one thing was that you discussed a little bit, let's see, the first author, he didn't quite have the concept of race there. So if he had it, it might have fallen between like species and varieties. I remember that.
That's right. That's right.
So I wonder, because like in the following years, centuries, race became a very anthropogenic concept. And how did that actually affect how scientists study like animal studies or plant studies? Yeah, so that was my first question. Was there any discussion about that? And second question is about ethnicity. I saw some categories like, you know, when they discussed the skull measurements, there were categories like Mongolian and Malay. So I was wondering if there was any, you know, discussion among scientists as to how to incorporate environmental factors into human biology.
The crucial fact here is that none of these words had a clear definition. They could mean a lot of things. And so you could negotiate the meanings of the word. Species is not clearly, it's still not clearly defined. You know, it's just a deeper division than varieties. Varieties is a modulation. It's a variance, but it's not a category distinction like species is. But none of these words has a clear definition. So you could argue that a race was a variety, as Blumenbach did, saying we're all basically the same with trivial differences. Or you could argue that race was a species, as Knott and others did, saying that these are categories of people with very, very different, you know, suites of capacities. Ethnicity is a term that is less rigorously biological, isn't it? I mean, there's a cultural dimension to ethnicity that there is not to race. There is, I think, an inescapably physical dimension to the concept of race. And Du Bois recognized this. He said, what is a race? And he was always vague about it. And he tried about 10 times to answer the question, what is a race? And he had things like, it's a vast family of human beings striving voluntarily or involuntarily towards common aspirations, common goals, common history, grosser physical differences, common blood. And those physical differences and blood indicate that for Du Bois, it wasn't just a matter of ideas in the atmosphere. There was a bodily component to it. And I think that people today who, and I realize I've stopped answering your question now, and I'm answering a question that's bothered me a long time. The people today who argue that race is entirely a social construct with no biological component underestimate the kind of implicit biology that's in the concept of race. Ethnicity does not have that association or connotation, but race, I think, does. If race were not biological, then Rachel Dolezal would still be the president of the Spokane chapter of the NAACP. But as it is, she's reviled as an imposter and a fraud. Why?
So
Yeah.
we've got one online, and then I'll circle on in the room again. So we have more of a comment. Can you comment on White Over Black by Jordan in the history of this idea?
White Over Black by Jordan, and all of Jordan's work is great. I mean, it is the, and especially in the fully expanded unfurling of his majestic argument, it's the most commanding account of race and race theorizing and racial relations in the United States. I completely recommend it. He's a
That was awesome.
Hmm.
Presentation. Thanks for it. And I think
Hmm.
a lot
Hmm.
to, just had one question. Do you think Carl Linnaeus was trying to get to with the different categories of Asian, American, European, and so forth? Do you think he was basically trying to get to a place of who was better?
I don't think so, although you could read that into his descriptions, couldn't you? The fact that Ethiopians or what's this category? That's right, Africans are governed by caprice. You know, it's not a compliment, it doesn't seem. You know, Europeans are governed by laws, others are governed by opinions, but Africans are governed by caprice. It doesn't seem a compliment. But his project was not ideological in that sense. As I said, he cataloged 10,000 items, animal, vegetable, and mineral. This is maybe the most important one because he's talking about human beings, which you care about more than the others. But his view was vast, and I don't think it was ideological in the sense that I think you're implying. Still, you could read that into it, and people did, I'm sure. Yeah. We have to understand that the information that people had about other people in the world was much more limited than what we have today. And a lot of it was filtered through travelers' tales, missionaries' accounts, soldiers' accounts, medical missionaries, or people who wanted to make a buck selling a colorful book about their exotic travels. And so the information that was on offer to anybody was very, very limited, of a particular kind.
Well, that's a crafty, indolent, and negligent are in stark contrast to the Europeans' inventiveness, right, and cuteness and gentleness.
That's right. Yeah. No, every word there is value laden, and you cannot help but feel kind of flattered if you're a European, can you?
So I'm gonna apologize in advance for butchering some of these words from this other question online. Can you also comment on Loki associated with skin pigmentation identified in African populations in Science 2017 by Crawford Wishkoff?
No.
Thank you so much for this presentation, and I'm really excited to delve into this website. And as a graduate student, I'm Elizabeth, I'm 7th year in the art history department. I'm very grateful that this is kind of open access and able to be accessed by so many people. I was wondering, I think I have a question about your kind of approach and methodology, because you've provided such a rich kind of understanding of these texts, which would be a different experience than if I were just to go on the website and read these texts without your kind of almost explanation and analysis. I'm just wondering, and this is a huge undertaking, I understand from your description, and I think you wrote an introduction I saw but that contextual, how did the goers to this website and reading these documents on their own, because there's so much, and I also feel from the questions that are being asked by you, to kind of explain these more nuances of the text.
Yeah. Well, this was a part of my work that somewhat took me by surprise, but it was easily the most interesting part. Isolating and finding the text, that was really challenging, because you actually got to read things that can be 900 pages long. Or in the case of Pritchard, whom I mentioned earlier, there's 4 editions and 5 volumes. And he talks about race, but it's not in the title of anything. Race did not appear in the title of anything until about 1850. It's just in there. And sometimes it's other terms that are like race. And so you actually have to understand these quite complicated, technical, sometimes medical or texts, and then figure out which passages are really carrying the weight of the argument, isolate those, gather them together, and then I thought I would write little headnotes. But these headnotes, I've got one here. Look at this. This is Blumenbach. This is, yeah. There's some I'm particularly pleased with. The one on Pritchard was the most difficult, but my aspiration was to make them sound clear and simple, as though all you have to do was know things and then write it out. But in many of these, since I'm linking with everything else and tracking the progress of things, every paragraph was a separate challenge. But I tried to make it read as if it was just an encyclopedia entry that, you know, somebody who knew a lot just wrote it out.
I look forward to spending time with the website.
I'm going to open up, oh, we've got a couple more in the room. Hang on.
Is there any indication that religion is a factor in placing racial designations?
Sorry, is there any indication that, did you say religion?
Would it be a factor that shows up?
No. I mean, I'm kind of rapidly scanning through scores of texts when I say that, but it was rarely the case. And one of the reasons was that religion didn't map onto observable differences very well. Jews and Arabs look a lot alike, but they have very different religions. The people in Europe might have different religions, but they're all Europeans. So it just didn't seem to be a factor that was available, certainly not to craniology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Asians or Buddhists?
Except when they're Hindus, yeah. Anyhow, the short answer I think is I don't think so. I don't recall any. And it's interesting that Jews were not considered a race until the late 19th century. Partly, as I said, because they had linguistic and physical affinities with the Arabs surrounding them. But also people found it possible to be anti-Semitic without being racial about it. But at the end of the 19th century, this argument began to be made. And of course, the beginning of the 20th century, leading straight up to the Second World War, this argument was made with some ferocity.
A quick follow-up to that. How were Arabs or Persians or Indians mapped according to these 18th and 19th century schemes? I didn't seem to have detected any explicit mention.
That's because I didn't talk about people like Joseph Denneker at the very end of the century, who produced a racial map. And you can see the mess that he was dealing with at the end of the 19th century. He was one of those who was arguing that this idea made no sense. Actually, he continued to work on this map, but his work became a kind of monument to ideas that he himself discredited. But you see how complicated it was. Various maps were produced, you know, early and late in this process. But of course, as people moved around more and more throughout the course of the century, the maps became harder and harder to draw. You know, it becomes more a matter of imposing order than documenting order. Did that answer your question?
Not directly, but it gives context. I mean, I'm just thinking of the US Census to this day, which has this category of Asian, for example, and maybe a lot of East Asians will recognize themselves in that category.
Maybe they won't.
But maybe they won't, and I know that a lot of South Asians just don't know what to do.
Yeah, well,
Right.
if you started off in the late 18th century with a general consensus that there was European and Asian and African, it became obvious, Blumenbach understood this, that Malay was not Asian. I mean, it was a lot of people, but it was not Asian. So he introduced the category of Malay, which had a kind of flickering endorsement throughout the rest of the century. As I said, there was no consensus on the number of races, with the guesses ranging from the human race. Incidentally, this was Frederick Douglass. Douglass was one of those who thought that we should do without the concept of race altogether. The human race to 63 at the top end. And so the South Asians were not the only ones who had a kind of uncertain existence in the cartography of race.
On the other hand, probably in the estimation of some, Indians were lumped into the Indo-European linguistic groups, which of course is not a race, but suggests something akin to a race.
The figure here is Sir William Jones, a name you probably know. He was an administrator, colonial administrator in India, and a deeply learned man. And he was the one who figured out that there was a Proto-Indo-European language beneath the ancient languages that we know. There was an antecedent language that was feeding all these three streams. And he explored this as tremendously suggestive. And for a while, philology was thought to be a reliable key to racial identity. But when people began to know more about the migratory habits of people, they could see that the same people could wind up speaking a different language, and the other way around as well. The same language could be spoken by different people. And philology began to lose status as an indicator of racial identity, but that possibility was entertained for a while.
If there are other questions, I'm happy to yield. If not, I'm happy to hog it.
Well, we have hit our time. You may have a few minutes afterwards, but I just want to say thank you again for coming and speaking at Wednesday Civic Center.